Hi, my name is Endever Corbin and my pronouns are they, them, theirs or z, them, theirs. I'm a mostly non-speaking autistic here to talk to you today about AAC, or Augmentative and Alternative Communication. Please note that my talk is going to mention ableism, abuse, and APA, if those are difficult topics for you. First, I want to tell you a little bit about my own story. I was in speech therapy growing up, and all I can remember is them pushing mouth words and proper pronunciation. I know they just wanted me to fit in and talk like everyone else, but they didn't realize how hard the motor planning was for me and how it was just getting more and more exhausting the more I tried to pronounce things correctly. My brain just doesn't connect to my mouth the way other people's do. I wasn't diagnosed autistic at the time, and I could say some things, so I don't think it occurred to anybody to offer me alternative ways of communicating. Similarly, I don't think it occurred to them to ask me whether I actually wanted to learn to pronounce things like other people did, or whether I was comfortable with the way I sounded. But I don't think other people actually couldn't understand me. My pronunciation wasn't unintelligible, just different. So were all those years training me to speak more typically worth it? The thing is, all that effort put into making me sound like other people had a lasting impact on my self-esteem. I was given stickers and rewards for pronouncing things right in drills and homework when I got it wrong, which honestly is inching towards a harmful ABA methodology. So I was coming home with a message: the way you naturally do things is wrong. This was happening in more areas of my autistic life than just my relationship to mouth words, but speech was definitely a major area I felt like who I wasn't okay. And so I proceeded to spend the next couple decades forcing myself to use speech at any cost. And the cost was high. I went into and out of autistic burnout for years, especially when trying to work jobs that required a lot of unscripted spoken communication. My co-occurring mental illness was getting worse and worse because all my energy was going into masking. I found myself gravitating towards informal solutions like writing notes or texting people in the same room, but I still had no idea what AAC was or even that I was autistic. Coming into the autistic community saved me in so many ways, and information about AAC, which means augmentative and alternative communication, and the implicit permission to use it is a huge one. I learned that even autistics who have thought of themselves as speaking or intermittently speaking might benefit from incorporating AAC into their lives, either full-time or part-time. For many, or maybe most autistic people, our ability to use mouth words is not a static experience. Our motor skills and word retrieval, and sensory overwhelm and all sorts of other factors are always changing. So for example, someone who speaks almost all the time might still find that they need AAC in a meltdown or a shutdown. And for me, I have just found that my overall quality of life improves significantly when I use AAC as much as possible. I can redirect the energy I was spending on mouth words towards things like executive function, sensory processing, and managing my other disabilities instead. Now I use AAC something like 90% of the time, and life is much better for it. So let's talk about AAC. What even is it? Most people I know describe it as any form of communication besides mouth words. So this device I'm using is definitely AAC, but there are a ton of other options as well. Personally, I use a mix of methods. This device has an app on it where I choose symbols to compose my sentences, and another app where I type on the QWERTY-style keyboard. I also use American Sign Language a large portion of the time. And when neither of those are ideal, I pointer letters or symbols on hard copy communication boards. Occasionally I use spoken word approximations, or simple mouth sounds that stand in for full words that people close to me can understand. I also nod, shake my head, point, stim, write emails, post to social media. Yes, those could be considered AAC too. So as you can see, almost everyone uses some form of AAC. It's just speech that not everyone uses. There are such a wide range of options for augmentative and alternative communication, whether high-tech or low-tech. I use my fingers to direct select buttons, but people with more motor control problems can still use communication devices by switch scanning or eye gaze technology. And a friend of mine who is also a part-time AAC user is actually studying brain-computer interfaces right now, which could potentially allow people with zero motor control to still communicate. All this is to say, please don't label someone in your life nonverbal and leave it at that. For one thing, many non-speaking people have found that others interpret the term nonverbal to mean doesn't understand language at all, and then we are treated worse, or even abused or assaulted because of that. But also, besides the fact that you should acknowledge we probably understand more of what's going on around us than people realize, we all have the capacity to communicate. We are whole people with thoughts and feelings that we want to share with you if we can just find the tools that are most accessible to us to do so. You can support us in that quest, and that's why I'm teaching you all of this today. AAC is such a wide field it might feel overwhelming to look at a list of all the options and not know where to start. So I want to give you some more detailed information about a few different AAC methods to sort of demystify what's out there. Keep in mind the only person who knows what works best for them is the AAC user themselves, so you might need to trial various options to see what they take to the most. You can use your understanding of their abilities and preferences to guide your choice of what to try, but don't give up if you don't get anywhere with the first option. I also encourage directly asking the AAC user what looks like the most useful communication method to them after showing examples of a few. Some of us will answer that question with mouth words, or point to our choice, or shake our heads yes and no. Others of us don't have a way of answering yet, but by asking anyway you are demonstrating that you know we have valuable perspectives and deserve to give input on our own lives, so go ahead and ask. The first thing I'll show you is my symbols-based high-tech app. There are a ton of different brands out there and various people have various preferences, so you'd want to do some research before investing in something right away. This one I use is called ProLoco 2 Go, and it only works on Apple products is probably its big limitation. Each word has its own button, organized into folders and categories. They have picture symbols to help differentiate which is which for folks who prefer images over text. My favorite thing about this app is how customizable it is. I can change the layout or grid size or symbols or vocab or color coding to whatever works best for me. When using this kind of app, you want to put as many buttons on the page as the AAC user can see and touch. This is both so that they don't have to relearn where everything sits on a bigger grid size later, and so that they have access to as robust a vocabulary as possible from the very beginning. You want to consider any visual impairments and motor skills issues that might make navigating smaller buttons difficult, but the more buttons you can manage on one page, the less time it will take to reach any given word in a subfolder. Something to keep in mind is that while for many of us using this kind of app is going to be much easier than trying to speak all the time, it can still take quite a while to learn how to use. I'll talk a little more about that later when I introduce you to the idea of modeling. Apps like this are a popular choice for young children that might not know how to read and spell yet, but many autistic adults find having pictures helpful for them too. When I first got it, I thought it was going to be a backup method for me for when I'm coming out of meltdowns, but I think at this point I use it more than my QWERTY-based app. It is a relief to not have to press so many buttons for each word like when I spell everything out. Another option for symbols-based AAC is hard copy symbols or photos, for example on cards or in binders. Some of you may have heard the word PEX before when talking about this kind of thing, but I want to be clear, The acronym PECS doesn't refer to pictures as a communication tool. It refers to a specific method for training someone to use pictures, which is based on ABA principles and so should be avoided. Picture cards are great and useful for many people, but if you have a speech therapist that says they want to introduce PECS, clarify what they mean before proceeding. The other concern I'll bring up with picture cards is that they are typically a really limited range of vocabulary, which isn't fair to the AAC user, who may have many other things they want to talk about. Some people think introducing only a few words at a time is best, but there's no way to know what someone wants to express or is able to express until you give them the chance. So if you're going to go with hard copy pictures, I'd say instead of giving the person a handful of picture cards, look into full binders of grid-based pages so that they have access to comprehensive vocabulary from day one. It's also worth noting that people whose main AAC method is a high-tech device should also have some sort of hard copy backup like this for emergencies. You never know when your device is going to break, run out of batteries, or just need to be protected from the rain. Another major form of AAC is to spell out each word, either typing into a high-tech device or by pointing to a hard copy letterboard. One big benefit to this approach is that the vocabulary is inherently unlimited, but of course it's not accessible to everybody. Some spellers or typers will prefer an alphabetical layout and others prefer QWERTY like on a standard keyboard. One problem I've found with using letterboards is that many people have a hard time following what I'm saying, so it does help to have speech generation technology so my communication partner can listen rather than put my spelling together into words visually. Many AAC users like using both symbols and spelling at different times, and it's important to allow us to switch between them freely. Some of us will be faster at one than the other, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the one that is easier for us. I am usually faster at typing, but often using picture symbols is easier for me. It's important to understand that for many autistic AAC users, we experience an extreme disconnect between our body and brain. For some of us, this may be localized in oral motor skills only, but for many, the same disconnect affects our fine motor skills or gross motor skills as well. So you might see autistic spellers who need 4 or 5 minutes to get out one sentence. That's okay. Normalize waiting patiently in the silence. It just takes incredible concerted effort to get our hands to go to the right spots over and over and over. We might need to take breaks to jump up and down, pace, or flap our hands. The first thing you can do to support our communication is to firmly believe that we have something to say and we will be able to say it if we are supported well enough. Let that belief seep out from your very pores. For most non-speakers, they've been surrounded by people their whole lives who think they don't understand anything around them. They're not treated like real people. But one of the key sayings in the AAC field is, presume competence. Believe that we have the capacity to learn to express ourselves. Or another way of thinking about that idea is, an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because you haven't seen proof that we are whole people with thoughts and feelings that we are able to express in some way doesn't mean it's not true. We may just not have been given the right supports yet that would enable us to prove you wrong. Consider that a fault in our environment, not in us. The problem is not that we are not speaking. The problem is lack of access to AAC. Oh, before I move on, I want to note that there's kinds of spelling and symbols-based AAC that some professionals disparage because there's been research designed by able people that supposedly disproves them. If you've heard of facilitated communication or the rapid prompting method, those are techniques that many autistic people find incredibly helpful, and I hope you won't toss them out as an option just because non-autistic people tell you they're not legitimate. Honestly, as far as autistic advocates can tell, a big reason they are discounted is because it's a way to silence the perspectives of non-speaking autistics, who often have a lot of critical things to say about the professional field. If you can claim that the person spelling something out isn't actually the author of their own words, it's a free pass to disregard everything they say. This is a really vicious form of ableism that denies the agency and personhood of AAC users. It is really important to us that scientists start using community-based participatory research methods so that they can better understand how these AAC methods can help us. If they continue designing studies without our input, of course they're going to get skewed results. One promising study out recently that used eye tracking technology provided evidence that backs up what autistics have been saying all along, which is that facilitated communication users are indeed the author of their own words. Of course, with FC there is the potential for abuse, but that's true of things like language interpretation too, and no one discounts them across the board. Okay, I'll move on from that soapbox to another AAC method. Most deaf people I've talked to who use sign language as their primary language don't see it as AAC, but for a hearing person who uses it as expressive communication to support a speech disability, it could be considered AAC. I use my country's sign language regularly. I am lucky that my support worker understands enough of it for that to be feasible, and I'm just so grateful to the deaf community for nurturing this language in the face of terrible ableism, because it makes the world so much more accessible to me. It is significantly quicker than my other AAC methods, and I feel I can be more expressive in sign than I am able to be with my device or with speech. You might know a common experience for autistics is difficulty modulating or interpreting different facial expressions and tones of voice. Well, I think typical hearing facial expressions were difficult for me because I was expected to just pick them up magically. In contrast, when I studied sign language, deaf-normed facial expressions were taught explicitly as an integral part of the vocabulary and grammar, so they are much easier for me to understand and use. I also have auditory processing problems as part of my experience of autism. You can maybe see my hearing aids I wear to help with this. They help filter out the background noise I can't process. So when people I am interacting with can't sign back to me, I understand more of what's going on than when I'm relying on my ears alone. Because of this, I often use interpreters for things like medical appointments. Not everyone can learn sign language easily due to motor skills issues or visual processing problems, but for me it's an essential part of my AAC toolbox. Okay, let's talk a bit now about alternative access. As I mentioned earlier, I use my fingers to point to the letters or symbols I want to choose. That's called direct selection. But my fine motor skills are better than many autistic people's, and it's possible you know a non-speaker who finds direct selection far too difficult even after a lot of practice. Alternative access means other ways of choosing the components of your message. The two high-tech versions of this I know of are switch scanning and eye gaze technology. For my friends who use switch scanning, their device is set to scan over their grid line by line and then square by square, waiting for them to hit a single large switch when it's settled on the selection they want. This is especially helpful for folks who only have control over a few muscles in their body. For example, the switch might be mounted on their wheelchair next to their head because they are able to deliberately move their head, but the rest of their body isn't under their control. It can also be useful for autistics who find that it is easier to get their hands to make a big and exact movement at the right time rather than to make a very precise movement like selecting a tiny button. With many AAC apps for tablets, you can set up switch scanning so that you don't need external hardware. Once you turn it on, the whole screen acts as a switch. This means you don't need to be able to point with one finger or hold a stylus. You can just hit any part of your hand against the screen when it gets to the option you want to select, which can be a game changer for many folks. Eye gaze technology is incredibly expensive, but for people who don't have enough voluntary muscle control to operate a switch, this kind of device can track where your eyes are focused on the screen in order to understand what selections you want to make and then play your words aloud. Some people think alternative access is just for AAC users with physical disabilities, but it's important to keep in mind the brain-body disconnect we talked about earlier. For some non-speaking autistics, autism does feel like a physical disability. It's really frustrating to tell your body to do one thing and have it do another. So if someone is struggling to use AAC with direct selection, it's really worth looking into alternative access technologies. A sort of hack for alternative access that doesn't require any special tech and can be used with letterboards and paper symbols books, is called partner-assisted scanning. This can be used with anyone who has a yes or no indicator, or even just a single yes indicator. It works very much like switch scanning, but instead of a machine highlighting different sections of the communication board and then individual squares, your communication partner does that. I have done this with a letterboard with a friend when her device wasn't working. She is able to move her head slightly and sometimes make a small sound to indicate yes, that one. So I would run my finger along one line of letters, and then the next, and then the next, waiting for her to tell me which one she wanted. Once we got the line narrowed down, I'd point to each letter on that line until she picked one. Then we started back with the lines to get to the next letter. It was slow but entirely effective. For communication partners who are able to speak, you can also list the options allowed as you point to them. Keep in mind not everyone's yes indicator will be the same, and even for one person it might not look exactly the same every time. So you need to work closely with the AAC user to get to a point where you can read their indicator reliably. Partner-assisted scanning can also be incredibly efficient for folks who would otherwise need to craft sentences through switch scanning. One of my friends frequently will use his device and head switch to say a single word, and then his support staff will use partner-assisted scanning, in this case, yes-no questions, to narrow down what it is about that topic he wants to say. It's much quicker and less effort for him than if he tried to write out all his thoughts word by word with his head switch. Okay, those are what I would consider the main kinds of AAC. I hope that wasn't overwhelming. I don't want to scare you away, but instead help you realize that there are just so many options out there. So you never need to give up and think, okay, this person will never be able to communicate. Their communication may look nothing like able communication, but if you vehemently believe that they have something to say and do everything you can to support them in finding a way to say it which they find accessible, I really think their quality of life is just going to improve so much. Communication is right, and even if it works a little differently for autistic people, having access to a form of it that is comfortable for us can make a world of difference. I know I said I wasn't trying to be overwhelming, but I imagine some of you listening are like, help. Where do I even start? That's a great question. But to lead into it, let's also touch on, when do you start? My answer to that would be, right now. I don't care how young or old the autistic person is. It is never too early to introduce AAC, and it is never too late to introduce AAC. 5 years old and they don't speak at all? Start AAC. 18 months old and they are having trouble babbling with all the same mouth sounds that other kids their age do? Start AAC. 40 years old and burnt out from decades of forcing themselves to speak? Start AAC. Of course you'll want to put in some research before just impulse buying a high-tech device you know nothing about, but there's no reason you can't start offering communication supports the minute you get off this webinar. Maybe you're going to be cooking dinner soon? Deciding between soup and macaroni? Try grabbing a soup can and a box of macaroni from the pantry, and go over to where the autistic person you know is sitting. Set both of those down next to them. Say their name to get their attention, and then say, I'm cooking dinner. Do you want to eat soup? Point to the soup. Or do you want to eat macaroni? Point to the macaroni, and then say, do you want to show me which one you want? Maybe they won't respond at all, or maybe they'll use mouth words to answer out of habit. But it's also possible they'll look at or point to the one they want. That's AAC. You have just opened up another communication method for them. They might not take to it right away, but you're offering options, and that's infinitely important. There's a huge myth out there, or maybe it's just an assumption that too often goes unchallenged, that access to AAC will discourage a person from developing speech skills. I have two responses to this. First of all, there's no evidence to back that up. In fact, there's evidence suggesting that AAC might be more likely to encourage the development of mouth words in someone that has previously been struggling with them. In other words, the idea that introducing AAC will prevent an autistic person who might otherwise speak from ever doing so is just not true. If they're going to learn to speak at some point, AAC is not going to stop that, and might even make it happen sooner and more easily. But secondly, and I think this is the more important piece, let's break down the erroneous assumption to look at its implications. Let's say the myth were true, and access to AAC inhibited speech. I want you to really think about, why would that be a bad thing? Usually when people worry about this issue, it's because they consciously or unconsciously think that AAC is inferior to speech. Please challenge that line of thought every time you feel it coming up in your brain. There is absolutely nothing wrong with using AAC, and speech is in no way superior to it. Sometimes if I push someone on this point, they'll realize their worry is less about AAC being inherently inferior and more about how the world is likely to treat their loved one who might use AAC. Okay, that's legitimate. Ableism totally exists. But if your response to it is to try to change an autistic person's communication methods rather than to try to change the society that is mistreating them due to their communication methods, you're actually participating in that ableism. Please, focus at least as much of your time and energy on changing society as you do on changing the autistic people you know. We are not the problem. AAC is not the problem. Ableism is the problem. So AAC doesn't inhibit speech, but you should also push yourself to examine why you're worried about that and start shifting your view of it. Something else to consider along these lines is that autistic people of all ages have the right to communicate now, whether or not it is going to impact the development of different communication methods long term. Can you imagine going a day without a way to communicate? Let's say you can smile and laugh and cry and gesture, but you're not allowed to speak, type, write, point, or use signs or pictures to communicate. What would that day be like? Think about how work or school would go, and what spending time with friends and family would look like, and running errands. Keep in mind you couldn't answer the phone or send text messages at all that day. You might not even be able to eat, drink, use the bathroom, have alone time, or otherwise get your basic needs met when you wanted to. I suspect that most of you would find that day pretty frustrating, if not downright terrible. Now I want you to imagine living that way for a week, or a month. What about a year? Could you live like that for a year? What if, after 4 or 5 years of this, you found out that your loved ones could have given you other options? What if they could have changed the rules at any point and returned some form of communication to you, maybe typing, maybe pointing to pictures, just anything more than you had access to for all those years, but they had decided for you that it would be better in the long run to withhold those options? How would you feel? Would you agree with them that all those years without a comprehensive communication system, all that frustration, was worth it? This is the reality a lot of non-speaking children face. At 2 years old, everyone assumes they'll just be a late talker. At 3 years old, they get put in speech therapy. At 5 years old, they get put in a segregated classroom for students with disabilities. Maybe eventually they manage to get a mouth word or two out under pressure. And at 10 years old, maybe 15, they might finally get a speech therapist to suggest AAC. But even then, their caregivers wonder, but what if it stops them from ever learning how to speak fluently? I'd like to suggest that there's no reason good enough to deny a human being from accessing communication for 10 or 15 years. Honestly, I don't think there's a good enough reason to deny a human being from accessing communication for 2 years, for 1 year, for any amount of time. I don't want a single non-speaking person to have even one more of those frustrating days in their lifetime, if it can be avoided. Of course, being given access to AAC doesn't mean we'll pick it up immediately. We're still going to need a lot of time and practice. But able people not even giving us the opportunity to learn, at any age, is a human rights violation. We deserve to communicate now. There's another angle to this, which is, maybe you know an autistic person who does have some speech. They might have difficulty stringing long thoughts together, or they might have some pronunciation problems, or maybe from the outside, their speech is perfect. It might even seem effortless to you. I want you to set those impressions aside. Stop believing that you can tell what their experience of speech is by observing. They are the only person on the planet who knows how hard it is for them to speak and whether or not what comes out of their mouth matches what they're really trying to say. Many more autistic people than you would guess experience fatigue or exhaustion when they have to rely on speech. We might not fully realize it because we don't know there are other options, but it's happening. Also, many autistic people have unreliable speech, which is when your mouth can pronounce words, but they don't represent your true meaning. It's back to that brain-body disconnect. These experiences also lead to extremely frustrating days, months, years, decades. Everyone around us thinks we're fine, that we communicate just like them, accurately and without effort, but internally we're screaming in exasperation. Maybe we don't even know what's wrong, we just know we're tired all the time, or people never understand what we mean. This is certainly a different experience than being completely non-speaking, but I suspect the two experiences are more similar than they are different. Again, people are withholding AAC from us due to their own assumptions and misconceptions. So truly, not only do all autistic people deserve to communicate now, we deserve to communicate now in a way that is accessible to us and comfortable to us, a way that doesn't take undue effort, a way that effectively and accurately represents our intentions. When people assume speaking autistics never need AAC, this is another way our human rights are violated. Okay, so we've talked about why to start AAC and when to start AAC. Hopefully you're getting the message. Everyone deserves AAC, and everyone deserves it now. So let's get back to that question of where you can start. How do you know what AAC systems to trial? First of all, you should definitely ask the person directly what they're interested in after showing examples of some options. But of course, they might not have a way to answer yet. In some situations, you might have so little solid information that you just have to, essentially, guess. And if what you guess doesn't work out after a lengthy experiment, you move on to a different guess. Trial and error. But if you've known an autistic person for a long time, it's likely you've noticed some patterns in their responses to the environment that can help inform your guess. Maybe they respond well to visual schedules. It seems like having pictures helps them understand what to expect better than when you explain it in words. Maybe they seem super interested in letters and text. You can't tell if they're reading or not yet, but they love paging through books and looking at menus and road signs. Maybe they have a really good pencil grip and tracing skills. Maybe you've noticed their general fine motor skills are particularly solid. They are comfortable manipulating small objects and moving their fingers in precise ways. These can all give you clues as to what AAC methods you might want to trial first. If you can't get a direct response about what kinds of AAC they think they want to explore, look for these indications that might suggest they would be particularly suited to pictures, letters, handwriting, sign language, etc. You can certainly also seek out a speech-language pathologist to do an AAC assessment that will try to evaluate the autistic person's strengths and weaknesses. But if waiting lists are long, or you have trouble finding a good fit, you can certainly introduce AAC on your own. If you have an idea of what modality you want to try out first, for example, pictures, spelling, sign language, but want to narrow down an exact choice of AAC system in that modality, the internet is your best friend when it comes to doing research. Many high-tech AAC apps have websites with tutorials or how-to videos that give you an idea of how their products work. Sometimes you can find demonstrations on YouTube that compare different devices. And social media and blogs are a great place to learn as well. There are a few busy AAC groups on Facebook, but my favorite is definitely the one called Ask Me. I'm an AAC user. It's a good place to get input from AAC users with a wide variety of needs and experiences. And there's definitely a lot of autistics in there, many of whom have used more than one AAC system and have lots of advocacy experience. So whether you're having trouble narrowing down options or you're getting started on a system and want help with the technicalities, it's a great resource. Cost can definitely be an issue. I don't know much about how medical care, disabled education, and charities work in Ireland, so I won't go much into this, but there are a few things to know if your finances are limited. At least in the States, some medical insurance companies and some school districts will cover the cost of AAC devices, but you have to work with a professional to get access to that. Also here, there are charities that are lending libraries of equipment for people with disabilities, designed for people to borrow expensive assistive technology short-term to see if it works for them before investing in a purchase. So it's worth looking into whether you can test out a device from somewhere like that. But if all else fails and you're definitely going to have to spend your own money in order to access a high-tech device, there are a couple of tricks. First, generally speaking, putting AAC software on a store-bought tablet is usually cheaper than buying a standalone AAC device. If you don't already have a tablet you can put an AAC app on, it's definitely worth watching the prices on those for a few months, so that when they drop particularly low on sale you know it's a good time to buy. That can sometimes get you 25% or more off of the usual list price. And then importantly, a lot of major AAC apps go on sale for a few days every April and a few days every October. The best place to find out exact dates on these is to get involved with AAC groups on social media, which typically post about these sales when info is released each year. A lot of the companies give a 50% discount for those days, so if you can borrow a system in the meantime or use low tech while you're waiting, those sales can make AAC affordable for far more families than would usually have access. It's also worth seeing if you can find discounted App Store gift cards to cut down on the cost even more. These can sometimes be purchased for 15% off their value. It still won't be possible for everyone, but using these strategies I was able to private pay for my own AAC system, despite my disability benefits being below poverty level, so I definitely recommend looking into it. Okay, let's say you've done your research, you've decided on an AAC system to try, and you've figured out funding. What next? Do you just open up a box, install an app, and hand the device to the autistic person? Do you print a letterboard, set it near them, and cross your fingers? Well, not really. A few autistic people will easily explore AAC with almost no information about it, but most will need extensive modeling at least to get started. What's modeling? Okay, if you get into official sources that teach caregivers how to model AAC, they might mean something different than I do. To me, what modeling should be is simply communicating with the autistic person by using the same AAC system they have. This does so many things they help us learn. First of all, you're demonstrating exactly where to find each button, how to spell each word, what each sign looks like, etc. But just as importantly, you are showing them that AAC is a normal and valid form of communication. I can't tell you how much work it's taken me as an adult who is only surrounded by speaking people most of my life to learn that speech is not actually superior to other forms of communication. By conversing in AAC with the person you know who is learning how to use it, you are showing them that whatever way of communicating works best for them is absolutely acceptable and encouraged. This doesn't mean I want you to prompt, coax, or guide them. I just want you to communicate with them. Have a conversation with them, using AAC. To be clear about where else my views differ from professional advice, some sources will tell you to only model one word at a time at first. For example, they might have you press the button for cookie on a communication device, and then say aloud, "Do you want a cookie, Johnny?" Say cookie. And point to the button again to prompt the AAC user. Or once the AAC user gets one word at a time down, they'll say model two at a time, and so on. But personally I am not a fan of this approach. It's true that some non-speaking people have auditory processing issues or receptive language problems that mean they might have an easier time learning this way. But unless you have evidence of that, I think it severely misses the point of presumed competence to talk to emerging communicators like this. In my opinion, in this situation, you should literally just use the AAC to say the entire sentence. I'm getting out cookies for snack Johnny. Do you want any? That's it. That's what you say to a non-disabled child you expect to learn how to speak, right? So say that to the AAC user, just using AAC instead of speech, or alongside speech. I think most AAC users, like most speaking children, learn how to form complete sentences the best by being exposed to them from day one. If you'd normally speak a full sentence to them aloud and expect them to understand it, there's no reason not to model the same thing in their own communication modality instead. An important point to note here is that you should expect it to take far more modeling than you think you'll need before the AAC user begins to use their AAC system back to you. Keep modeling more than you think is needed, and without expectation that they reply. Give them opportunities to communicate, but don't pressure them to respond to you. And don't give up. An average 18-month-old has heard over 4,000 hours of people speaking to them and around them by the time we really expect them to speak back to us. Far too often I see people saying, well, we tried AAC, but the autistic person wasn't interested. Okay, how long did you try it for? A few weeks, a few months. When you were a baby, do you think you would have learned to speak if you'd only been around people speaking for a few weeks or a few months? What about now, as an adult? Could you pick up a second language in a few weeks or a few months? Please, give the autistic AAC user at least 4,000 hours of exposure to AAC before you think we're not interested or we can't do it. Of course, many of us won't need anywhere close to that many, but some might need more. Whether we finally start using AAC for ourselves a month from now, a year from now, or a decade from now, our quality of life will improve so much. That's not something you want to give up on. One more important note is that most disabled people who use assistive technology such as mobility devices and communication devices feel strongly that those items are extensions of our body, and other people touching them without our express permission is a significant violation of our autonomy. So as early as possible, teach the AAC user you know and everyone around them that their communication supports are truly their own, and other people don't have a right to use them or touch them without consent. But of course, what about modeling? Well, best practice for modeling for someone who uses high-tech AAC would be for you to have the same app installed on a second device so that you're not constantly taking away the AAC user's voice in order to model. Can you imagine if someone bigger and stronger than you could place duct tape over your mouth whenever they wanted to say something? Of course, you might not have a second device in your household and not be able to afford another. I get that. Another option for high-tech AAC users is for you to print out each screen of their communication system and place them in a binder that can be paged through, so that you can model using the same symbols and layout they're used to in their device. If a binder isn't possible, you can at least print out their home screen and model the core words you use in every sentence. And if for some reason none of these options are accessible to you, I'd recommend at least asking for permission before you touch the AAC user's device or low-tech supports, every time. They might not have a way of answering yet, but it's still important that you ask. If you can't tell if their answer is yes or no, you can say that before proceeding, I'm not sure if it's okay with you. I'm going to go ahead and use it, but you can take it away anytime, okay? And then when they get to a point where they can express yes and no in any way, honor that, even if what it looks like is just them grabbing the device out of your hands. I want to prepare you now that many of us will play with our AAC, use it to stim and echo, and babble random words with it for potentially quite a while before we start using it in a way that you recognize as communicative. This is just like speaking babies spending months and months babbling before they begin forming meaningful mouth words, and it should be celebrated and encouraged as part of natural language learning. You can support the AAC user in exploring their device and learning how to use it by making communication fun and meaningful. For example, if they're saying, cat, 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 cat all day with their device and giggling, you might think it's just a meaningless stim, but it's important not to ignore it. Respond by saying something like, wow, you sure like saying cat. Do you mean you wish we had a cat here? Or maybe you like the sound the word makes? This teaches them that their communication is understood to be meaningful, has an impact on their environment, and should be taken seriously by people around them. Before I move on from modeling, I want to touch on the idea of multimodal communication and how important it is to many autistic people. I love being a multimodal communicator, switching regularly between my device, sign language, speech, and low-tech backups. So although of course you don't want to completely overwhelm a child with several AAC systems at once, definitely consider offering more than one at a time. This gives them several opportunities. 1. If they have a strong preference between them, they can demonstrate that to you early on. Second, they're more likely to find a system that works for them sooner rather than if you model for years on something that doesn't work well for their brain. And lastly, they can develop skills on multiple communication methods so that they have more flexibility throughout the rest of their lives. There will always be times when a high-tech AAC user's device is low on batteries or malfunctioning, or times a letterboard user is talking to someone who's dyslexic, or a sign language user needs to communicate with someone who doesn't know any sign. These are all situations where being a multimodal communicator who can switch smoothly to a secondary communication method is a great advantage. So if what you're focusing your modeling on is symbols-based AAC, also have a letterboard handy too in order to demonstrate how words are spelled every so often. If your focus is usually on spelling, also show them the signs for keywords sometimes too. For many people, there is no reason to limit your modeling to only one communication method. Of course, if they make it clear they favor one method over another, narrow in on that, but it's worth introducing multiple methods for a while at least. Okay, remember when we were talking about how you should focus at least as much of your energy in changing ableism in the world around autistic people as you do on changing autistic people themselves? Let's talk now about what you can practically do to change the world around an AAC user to be more accessible and respectful. First of all, don't think of AAC modeling for the user as the only kind of modeling you do. Abled people need someone to show them how to respectfully interact with AAC users, because in general they're typically clueless about it. The first thing you can do is show them to presume competence. This means they need to talk directly to the AAC user, not about them as if they're not there or don't understand. If they ask you a question about the AAC user, you can say, "What do you think, Johnny?" and demonstrate a long pause to give Johnny plenty of opportunity to choose to answer. If they do ask the AAC user a question, but quickly give up on waiting for a response and turn to you instead, you can simply refuse to answer, turn to the AAC user, and wait patiently. Sometimes speaking people won't get these kinds of hints, and you should stick up for the AAC user you know by flat out saying things like, "You can ask them," or "She understands you," or "Please talk to him directly." Honestly, you might need to be persistent about this. I've often had people talk to my speaking friends and support people instead of me, and it's hard to get them to change their preconceptions and treat me like a human being who understands the conversation and might want to participate in it. Feel free to ask the AAC user you know if they have a specific preference for how you stick up for them in this kind of interaction. But if they aren't able to give you an answer right now, I say, err on the side of being firm with people around them that they must presume competence. Another thing you can do to make the world better for us is to relentlessly advocate for our access to AAC in the first place. Yes, this means fighting schools and therapists and health insurance companies to cover the cost of getting AAC that is conducive to our needs, if you can't afford to on your own. It means making it clear to teachers and parent educators that they are expected to model in every single interaction. It means teaching authority figures like doctors, babysitters, and school staff that it is never acceptable to confiscate or set aside someone's AAC for any length of time for any reason. You can also proactively make sure we can use our AAC in different situations by planning ahead about what environments you spend time with us in. We might need an electrical outlet to recharge our device, a quiet environment for you to hear our speech output, a low-glare environment for our eye gaze technology to work correctly, an assistant to support our letterboarding, or a sign language interpreter for everyone to understand us. Don't make plans without considering and discussing these accessibility issues. Advocating for our access to AAC also means making sure we have the opportunity to use a truly robust vocabulary rather than a more limited set of words. This includes words for body parts, abuse, consent, gender, and sexual orientation. I can't begin to tell you how many non-speaking kids are abused and literally can't report it because no one has given them the vocab. And how many queer and trans youth don't have a way to talk about their experiences and identities because someone thinks that who they are is too mature of the subject for them to be allowed to discuss. Hopefully these examples give you an idea of the power dynamics involved in being an AAC user, especially for folks who don't have the skills to modify their own AAC systems themselves. Teach us as early as possible how to add words and symbols for ourselves, and if we don't have the physical or cognitive ability to do so independently, then ask us on a regular basis what kinds of words we want added to our system. It is incredibly limiting to literally only be able to say the things that someone else thinks you want to say. You can also use what you know about AAC and autistic communication to educate people around you about how they can be supportive. When my friend and I were interviewed for an AAC blog post several months ago, we were asked what the biggest challenge is when it comes to using AAC. What did we answer? Not the technology, not expressing ourselves, not any of the things you might expect. Rather, our answers were other people, ableism, and other people being ableist. So make sure everyone in your life knows how to be more accommodating. Wait longer than you think is needed when giving an AAC user the opportunity to respond. Not just a second longer, but more like double the amount of time you think is good. Honestly speaking, people are absurdly uncomfortable with silence, and that is one of the first things you have to get over to be our friend. Also, be mindful of how and when you're interacting with us. Asking us questions while we're doing dishes, or asking more than one question at a time in any situation, can make it very difficult for us to answer. And to directly ask each AAC user what our other preferences are for how to interact with us respectfully. For example, many of us want you to wait quietly when you see us typing instead of carrying on the conversation while we're composing our messages, but other people might not like the implicit pressure to hurry. Many of us dislike it when people read over our shoulders or try to guess the ends of our sentences, but others prefer that you read their screens or save them the labor of button selection by guessing what they mean before they finish. So don't be afraid to ask us what we need from you, and then advocate for those self-selected norms to our other communication partners. Please also accept whatever form of communication we use first rather than saying things like use your words or say it on your talker. If it is clear to you that we want to go for a car ride because we keep handing you the keys, or clear we want a certain toy because we are pointing to it up on the shelf, respond to those messages rather than redirecting us to say them in a way you think is better before you're willing to acknowledge the content of what we said. All communication is communication, and if it doesn't harm anyone, there's no need to ask us to use another modality, no matter how much you want us to learn how to use it in the future. If you haven't been pressuring us, we will self-select the kind of communication that is going to work best for us in the moment, and that should be honored. Use your privilege as a speaking person to teach that to everyone around us. Finally, work towards changing the institutional ableism that puts structural barriers in our way throughout society. Fight for more funding for disabled education in your school system. Promote alternatives to adult guardianship such as supported decision-making. Advocate for proper accommodations in universities and workplaces, and find ways for AAC users to participate equitably in the political process. We deserve equal access to society, whether that's the right to an education, the right to safe housing, the right to freedom from coercion, the right to proper medical care, the right to contact our government to share our opinion on policy issues, or just the right to enter a shop and order coffee without being talked down to. If you're a speaking person, you need to recognize that you will be taken more seriously on these issues than AAC users themselves are, and use that power to help us create change in the world. Just always take leadership from the AAC user community rather than charging off on your own. That's part of remembering that we have thoughts and opinions that are important to honor. We have lots to say if you make a point to listen. Okay, this has been quite a lengthy introduction to AAC. Thank you so much for sticking with me. If I had to pick 3 main points I want you to take home, they would be these. All autistics deserve access to AAC. Presume competence in every autistic, no matter what forms of communication they do or don't use, and don't ever give up. The minute you decide that the autistic person you know doesn't need AAC, or doesn't understand what's going on around them, or won't ever learn how to communicate, you're the one stealing those opportunities from them, not autism. I think we have a couple minutes now for questions and discussion before Evaleen presents. I'm happy to take a stab at anything that's on your mind. You'll just have to be patient while I type. Don't worry, it's good practice.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Endeavour. You put so much information into that. I'm like, have I even got questions? You like answered so many things I wanted to ask you. It was brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing. I think there were some things I didn't even think about, to be honest. Like, do people confiscate AAC devices? Okay, so I have slides. First one is about me, just a little introduction. I don't want to take up too much time on it. But this is me on stage in February 2019 in Cork. And I was there because I organised for the first time ever an all autistic conference in Ireland. We hadn't had one up until then. And it was a pretty big event for our community. And I really don't think there is any issue that an autistic person can't really talk about for ourselves. And I think it's really important that we have as many platforms as we can to speak for ourselves. So I'm autistic since 2014. Well, obviously I've been taught autistic all my life. I found out in 2014. And since then I have been, I suppose, advocating for autistic rights, elevating autistic voices, educating people, whether it's online through our social media or whether it's on our training events or visiting schools or working with different organizations to improve their knowledge of autism or autistic people, and really trying to remove that stigma. You know, I am very proud of my identity, but it took me a while to get here and to fully understand actually what I meant when I was saying I was autistic. So yeah, I organize a lot of talks, conferences, online training. I've recently, I mean, one of the first things I did was design a social skills course, and not a traditional social skills course, which teaches us to mask. It's obviously written from the autistic viewpoint, so it's a very protective place about reading other people, you know, and I suppose trying to advocate better for ourselves and understanding our own type of communication. And I suppose that's developed over the past few years along with my own understanding, my own knowledge, and I recently put that into activity books for kids. So I'll send you out some links afterwards. But before I usually do anything, I usually, I don't have something in the chat for this because it's all on screen, but when I talk about autistics, I talk about human beings who have a different sensory system to non-autistic human beings. We interact with our environment differently to non-autistic people. That's it. It's just different. It's not less or, you know, dysfunctional or anything like that. It's just different. We have our own language and culture, which we're only beginning to explore as a community. And I think people are always a bit confused when I say that, but that's how I see. We talk about communication, but I also talk about our language and culture, because that's what it is. We communicate in our own language with other autistics, but our language is often misinterpreted by non-autistics. we also have an ability to hyper focus and to become experts on a subject, because learning for us is an emotional experience. It's something that we love. So I just, oh, why can't I open my chat? Okay, what is communication? Okay, so, sorry now. So before, I got, you'll have to forgive me. It's my first time doing this. Okay, yes. So, for a long time, autistic people have been challenging the idea that we've got poor or defective communication skills, or what people call social skills. So I'm going to show you a slide now. So this is research that was done in the University of Edinburgh by Dr. Catherine Crompton and Sue Fletcher Watson, and it was released last summer 19. For their research, they divided the groups into autistic-only group, they had a non-autistic group, and a mixed group of both autistic and non-autistic people. And they checked everybody beforehand too, because there were many of us going undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. So if you look at the bottom right diagram, you'll see 3 lines. The green line is the group which performed best. And you may get a surprise to know that that was the autistic group. The red line is the non-autistic group, so they did well also, although not as well as the autistic group. The yellow line is the group which did not perform so well, and this is the mixed group. And that yellow line represents the world we live in. This research proved that autistic people do not have deficits in communication, but it also showed that miscommunication happens between autistic and non-autistic people. So I see my role as a communication teacher and trainer to try to explain the differences and help to translate for both sides, so that we can create a better social environment for autistic people. But we cannot do that until the outdated and untrue ideas around us and our communication are forgotten, buried, and never to be challenged again. We have a lot of those to just bury now at this stage. And by seeing our communication as broken or defective, we're missing out on so many opportunities and moments of connection. And that's such a huge pity. We're also discriminating against autistic people. We're presuming that one way to communicate is better than ours. So we have a lot of work to do to change our narrow attitudes around communication. And when we think of communication, we often think of, sorry for the typo, we often think of language or words. I'd like to show you something which I learned about a couple of years ago. A language with no words, not even body language, because communicators don't even see each other. It's a language of sounds, and I hope it's going to, yeah, play for me now.
The whistling sound you just heard is a language that's thousands of years old. It's native only to a small island off the west coast of Africa called La Gomera in the Spanish Canary Islands.
Okay, so that's just a little taste of it, but I just think it just shows how limited our own understanding of what language is. And there's just so much more to language than just words. So I like to show that I had forgotten about it actually until the other day. I wanted to include it just to kind of, I think, open minds a little bit, that, you know, when we talk about language, we automatically think of words. So that brings me on to, you know, what is communication? Oh. So I've had different definitions of what communication is. I used to think of communication as, you know, transferring a message from one place to another, or from one person to another. There are lots of definitions, but I see communication as a way of sharing our internal state with the external world. So communication can be, that should be singing, signs, texting, body language, gestures, words, sounds, stims, and so on. You know, behavior is communication. How we act shows how the world around us, or shows us what the world around us is like. And behavior is a reflection of our environment. That's kind of how I define it. Although I'm very vocal, and I have a lot to say, words are not my first language. And to me, it seems like autistic people's language is more one of energy and movement, and that it's reflected in the way that, and that's reflected in the way that we stim. We're in constant communication with the world around us. Autistics, by and large, see others as equals, and this is a very beautiful thing, but it can cause difficulties in communication if other people don't understand that. So say the child who doesn't do as they're told because someone in authority tells them to, that can look like they're being cheeky maybe, but really they're not following rules blindly and see the other person as an equal rather than someone who's in control of them. So of course, when our way of seeing others as equals is not respected, it can create problems for us. So it can make us feel bad about ourselves. It can teach us to mask that aspect of our culture. Also, when non-autistics engage in chit-chat, they're basically sussing out where they fit in the social hierarchy in relation to the other person. And this is done so subconsciously that most are even unaware that they're doing it. But reading up on the psychology behind chit chat is really interesting. Autistic communication is very much about sharing. It can be sharing our emotions, like when we flap, sharing our ideas, like when we speak or write, sharing our vision through the world of art, through the vision of the world through our art, sharing information, like when we get super excited about our interests, I want to tell you all about them. We use communication to share information and to make deep connections. You know, we're generally not interested in the superficial stuff. We want to get to know the person. So sharing space and time with another can be communication for me. Some of my happiest moments as a kid were you know, car trips just in silence with my dad. Autistics will stand up for what we don't believe is right. We're not afraid to stand out from the group, and we will say it as it is. I think words matter to us, whereas non-autistic, you know, and what we say matters. We're quite literal in what we say. Whereas non-autistic communication seems to be more about using words for the social aspect that exchange brings to the people involved. Now, just a reminder that behavior is communication. If a child runs off, they're running away from something. If a child hides, they're telling you they're afraid. If an adult spends all their time at work, when they're telling you, you know, they're telling you that they're distracting themselves from something that's not right in their lives. It's important that we recognize this. Stimming. Okay, I'm going to talk about stimming. I'm going to talk about stimming because it's really important, and it's such a really important part of our communication. And this is, I put 2 slides together to explain the different functions of stimming. So I suppose that when I made this poster, I said that stimming was a human response to the environment. And now I say stimming is kind of more about creating a balance between the internal environment, so within the autistic person, and the external environment. But stimming is something that all human beings do. All of us, it's just autistics are really, really good at it. We've actually turned it into an art. It's really complex, really intricate stuff that we're doing. But because we're autistic, people just thought, it's just something we did to pass the time or to occupy ourselves. It couldn't be anything complex or intricate that we could be doing. So basically, people have missed out on this really cool thing that humans can do for a long time. But luckily, autistics are now explaining it to the rest of the world. So there's different functions to stimming. Stimming came from self-stimulatory behavior. Because that's what it looked like to people, that autistic people were just stimulating themselves. And it was shortened to stimming. That word basically is being, I suppose, reclaimed by the autistic community. Its meaning is totally different now to us, even though to some people it still is self-stimulatory behavior, or they think we just do it to calm ourselves. And we do sometimes, but it has a lot more functions, and I'm going to explain some of them. So soothing, and I'll give you a few examples. Soothing. So, stimming is usually a repetitive action that somebody does. So, most of us as babies, sucked our thumbs. So we had a repetitive action that soothes us. Likewise, when we rock a baby, that's us doing a repetitive action. That's us actually sharing a stim, because the baby's not doing it, we're doing it. And we're doing that to soothe them. And it's something automatic that most of us do. Or many of us do. I haven't done any. I don't know the figures. We also stim to stimulate ourselves. Yeah, we do it. All human beings do. Like if your leg falls asleep, you might tap it off the floor to remind your brain where your foot is. And we do it to express emotions. So a lot of autistic people might flap their hands and jump about when they're excited. And that's our way of expressing happiness and excitement, and it's great that most people, a lot of people don't recognize that now, but I have been in situations where I've asked a room of 30 people, what does that mean? And no one knows. And that's like parents and teachers and professionals, and nobody knows that that's I'm happy or happy or excited, And then, if we take it a little bit further, that's your communication. And it's the same as someone smiling. So when someone smiles, well, usually they get a smile back. So they find out that they're, as Endever was saying earlier, that their communication is meaningful, it's accepted, it's reciprocated. There's a communication and a feedback, because we all need feedback in our communications. I mean, that's a really important thing. So if you don't get that feedback, well, you don't get, you don't learn that's kind of you don't get that bond, I suppose, that social connection from your expressing your emotions. You also start to question what you're doing. You don't have anybody telling you, that just means you're happy and excited, like we do when kids smile. So, and then we wonder why later on we'll have difficulty identifying our emotions. Also, we get funny looks and people telling us to stop doing it. So, we're just expressing ourselves. We're just doing it in a different way. And it's really important that that's respected. We talk a lot about autism awareness, and people talk about autism acceptance. And I think I've gone past that. I just think we really need to respect what autistic people are saying, what we do, and just and respect our communication, and see it as something that's valid. I kind of usually put the next few together. Well, communicate. Sorry, I skipped one. So communicate, and this is something I mentioned during the week to Endever. I don't have enough, I suppose, experience in autistic spaces, in real life autistic spaces, but I have a few experiences where, another autistic person is stimming, and I've understood what they meant. But it's not like I could translate it into words, or, you know, there was a whole lot of thought involved. It was just a really cool thing to experience what someone meant by with their movements. And that's why I think we're only kind of beginning to explore it more and more. But I'd imagine that at some point we will be able to explain to the world, you know, kind of like sign language, that when autistics do this, this is what we mean. And yeah, we all have individual stims because we're human, but there are also lots of common stims, and those of you who've done maybe webinars with us before, with Mackie, you know, has done like a lot of research on this, and like across the world, you know, autistics have similar stims, which means it has to be something innate in us, and that's a really interesting aspect that you don't get to see or understand if you just think that stimming is a useless or kind of thing that we need to do to calm ourselves. You know, you're missing out on all of this part, that it's part of our language and part of our culture, and must have been back at generations for our ancestors, because that's, you know, how we're autistic because we have autistic ancestors, and they probably communicated the same way we did. Okay, so other functions of stimming are to take in information, process information, and to store information. The example I usually give is like when I was a teenager in secondary school, I would have drawn on my books a lot, and just nothing in particular, just different kind of designs. And again, it's not something I taught myself to do. I didn't know I was doing it until now, knowing about stimming and wanting to learn more and thinking back over my own life, I realized, oh, that was a stim that I did subconsciously. So basically what I was doing is I was drawing on my books, I was concentrating, but it wasn't just so I could concentrate. I was taking in information auditory or orally that my teacher was giving us. I was filtering it out and taking in the information that I needed, and I was translating that into visual pictures in my head, or memories basically, which meant then that I actually was learning on the spot. And I know other autistic people have maybe do this by rocking. They're processing the information and they're storing it. And I'm sure there are lots of different ways that autistic people do it. And I'm sure non-autistic people do it too. But again, it's not something that we've studied or we talk about when we talk about human beings and learning. But we do know that, like say for younger kids, if you teach them an action, like if you put actions with the words, they'll learn the words faster. We do know there's a relationship between movement and learning. And it's just interesting that we kind of haven't applied that to autistics, but that's probably because everything we do is wrong, basically. So, you know, storing information, you might see somebody doing something like this. It's basically like pressing enter on your laptop. It's just storing it for later on so that we can recall it. And that's another function. So like all of human beings, what do we do when we want to think something? You know, I'll do, you know, click my fingers and I'll say Some people would say and actually in most languages there's a verb, there's a sound that people do to recall what they're saying. So it's, again, it's something we all do. And it's to, you know, it's why does that? And help us to remember something. You know? I haven't got that far, right? But I know it's all connected. And isn't it fascinating? And like if you walk into their kitchen and you forget something and you walk back out, you remember it, you know, but why? Why is nobody kind of talking about how these movements are involved in our thinking and our learning? And I suppose while I've been, research, I was reading or researching, I don't do it on a professional level, but I do read a lot on stimming and things like that. But, you know, when I was in school, you know, as a teenager, I learned about REM, which is basically processing, you know, we have a repetitive eye movement and that's processing our information while we sleep. That's a very human thing. And then I had a wonderful therapist a few years ago and we did some EDMR, which is kind of following the movement of a pen with your eyes, you know, to process, you know, a traumatic event or something. And I was thinking to myself, well, this is like REM, you know, and I'm like, and now I know about stimming. And I'm going, well, both those things are stimming. You know? So basically, though, you know, stimming could be such a valuable tool. We're already using it for something like EDMR, and there's a tapping therapies and things like this. So we are actually using it. We're just not calling it stimming, and we haven't pulled all of these things together to kind of see what is the relationship between our body and our minds when we're learning and when we're storing things, and where are we storing it, which is really interesting. And lately I've been reading up on REM and what you do if you know, what happens to the body if we deprive people of REM. And you know, it's really interesting because what happens to autistics when we're not allowed to stim? You know, so there's a lot of parallels there. I won't go into that too much, but stimming is a really important part of our communication, and it's really important that I point out that extreme stimming, which is things like head banging or, you know, self-injuring behavior or injuring somebody else, that's not for pleasure or processing or learning or anything like that. That is a communication. That is a sign that the autistic person is suffering and their needs are not being met. And every single human being in the world would have the same response. And this is really important. You know, I asked a group that when I was training recently, you know, why would it, you know, forget about autism. Why would a human being bang their head off the wall? You know, and they were all able to say, well, frustration. But it's the same for us, you know, and that's why remembering we're human unlocks a lot of the mystery. So there are different types of stimming. So vocal is obviously ones you make with your mouth, throat clearing, humming, singing, saying the same line of a song over and over, or a few, you know, a lyric or a line of a poem, or sing a phrase. Physical ones are kind of flapping, moving about, whatever. Mental stimming is really interesting. It's kind of like playing with words in your head, or maybe singing a song while you're doing something. Auditory ones obviously involve listening. So, you know, listening to, well, for me, it would be like listening to a favorite new song over and 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 over, and not getting fed up of it and loving it as much each time. You know, tactile, obviously touching and rubbing things. Visual stimming is really interesting, and again, it's a human thing. You know, when you pull in at a lay-by and look out at a view, that's visual stimming. That's you enjoying something. That's you taking, you know, kind of something external, changing your internal state, creating that balance, and it's actually just, you know, making you feel good. So for me, fireplaces are, you know, a visual stim. Some people might be candles, other people might be glitter in water. And again, we can learn while we're visually stimming. You know, it's not always just for pleasure. We can be like playing with the light. We can be doing lots of different things. And olfactory is obviously sniffing and smelling and that, you know, I mean, why do we wear perfume and things? Like, you know, sensory input. We're all sensory beings, all of us, all human beings. I might send on people Mel Bag's video. I usually send it on when I do courses, I presume in my language. I remember the first time I saw it, it was just, I was like, how cool. It was about, I don't know, 3 years ago maybe. And I'm sure most people watch it and go, what a weirdo. But I was like, how cool is that? It's just amazing. And actually it taught me so much more about stimming. And it taught me, you know, how I communicate with, because Mel says that they're communicating. They talk about being in their language with their environment being, you know, isn't like language as we understand it. And that didn't make full sense to me, you know, when I heard it first, but now it does. I'm going to send that out to people, but I need to write it down because I'll forget otherwise. So in my language, it's a really cool video, and it kind of explains a lot of what I'm saying. For those of you who don't know, Mel was a wonderful advocate and has left us some, but unfortunately passed away in April, I think, and but has left some really good resources and videos and blogs behind them. Okay, so I wanted to put in, you know, things that people have to, I suppose Endever brought a lot of this up as well, you know, things that can impact our ability to interact, you know, how we feel about ourselves, you know, because people are always thinking of autism, or, you know, that the causes of our ability to interact is within us. But I think we have to look at our environment a lot more. I mean, that's, I believe for everything, we need to look at our environment more. What impacts anybody's ability to interact? Well, their confidence and self-esteem. You know, if I feel confident in myself, then I'm going to be a better communicator. I'm going to say what I want to say. And if I've got good self-esteem, I'm not going to be worried about what other people are thinking, you know. And I think that's why kids having access to, you know, things that aren't therapies, like after school activities. Like I did drama all my life, you know, art classes, just different groups, just things that they can actually build confidence, and that they can have time with like-minded people and have time with other autistic kids and build their confidence in their own community and in their own communication skills. And that translates then when they go out into the wider world, or, you know, into school, where there probably are more non-autistic people than there are autistic people. And it's really important that we have those opportunities. Anxiety is obviously a massive part of being able to communicate. I mean, anxiety literally stops some people from speaking. You know, I mean, there are reasons, lots of different, I suppose, different reasons why people don't or can't speak. We have physical reasons, you know, but there's also anxiety that might actually just completely overwhelm you in a situation and you can't get your words out. I mean, obviously I'm well able to kind of speak my mind now, but this is very new for me. This is like literally in the last 2 years. You know, I was diagnosed 6 years ago, and it's been a bit of a slow journey. But it's really only in the last 2 years that I've, you know, found my voice, and I'm not afraid to use it. Now I get really anxious and I get a lot of negative stuff said to me, and, you know, it's not that that doesn't bounce off me. I haven't developed a Teflon suit or anything, but, you know, I say what I want to say because I'm not actually overwhelmed by that anxiety or that fear, and not knowing how to kind of speak my mind, or I'm not afraid of confrontation, whereas I would have been, you know, most of my life. So, and again, I think it's important not to judge, you know, I'm sure people judge me all the time thinking that, you know, I'm like, I've never had any, you know, bad experiences in my life or anything. People seem to think that if you were able to go and do things and organize events and whatever, it's that, like, because you've had a grand time, you know, but like, I do it because it's a trauma response probably most of the time. Yes, yeah, Deborah's like nodding. I'm only just realizing this a lot lately, that a lot of the work that I'm doing is actually still a response to trauma, which is kind of annoying. But my past experiences, all of our past experiences obviously impact our ability to interact with people, you know, in the future. So, you know, if somebody accepts your way of communicating, if somebody makes you feel good, if somebody respects your communication, if somebody you know, makes an effort, you know, with you, you know, whether it's to understand what you're saying or just spend some time with you, you know, that's going to build make you feel safe, because a lot of us don't feel safe in social environments, you know, and that's social anxiety, you know, which is another type of anxiety. But it doesn't come from, you know, being autistic, or it doesn't come from being disabled, or it doesn't come from, you know, somewhere within. It comes from our past experiences, you know. And if we have been dismissed or, you know, treated badly in a social situation, it's going to affect the way we communicate the next time. Other people, you know, I think that's something Endever mentioned as well. Like, you know, people are always asking, like, what are your challenges? Which is like, do people ever think it's like, how bad has your life been? That's like, that's what they're asking you. And then they expect you to answer it, you know. So other people really need to work on their social skills, I find. Yeah, they just, you know, some people ask you these questions as if it's like they're just asking you what you had for dinner. It's like, you're just asking me a really personal question that's really invasive, might trigger me, but hang on, you know. So yeah, other people, what impacts on our ability to interact? Well, whether somebody accepts us or excludes us, that's really important, isn't it? That's going to really impact whether I can communicate. If I feel safe and comfortable with somebody, I can communicate just fine, you know. And even now, I've been in situations where I haven't felt safe or comfortable with people, and, you know, I just, you know, I'll be a totally different person, or I'll just run off into a little corner of my own. A sensory hostile environment, because obviously we're talking about communication, we're not going to spend too much time on sensory, but yeah, if there's a lot of distraction going on in the background, or if it's a noisy cafe and I'm meeting somebody for a chat, then that's not the best environment for me to communicate in. You know, so again, having an environment, a sensory or physical environment that's compatible for the way I communicate and the way I think and move and sense and feel, that's going to make communication with me better and easier. I had to obviously include masking, because masking is a really, masking is communicating something to people. Masking inhibits our communication, I mean, and I've said this before at other webinars as well, but like, I have masked nearly all of my life. I'm sure Endeavor has similar experiences. At the moment, I know like one autistic person who's telling me they don't mask. One out of all the autistic, I've come across thousands, but I know one person who says they haven't masked in their life. And that's pretty amazing that we have someone who hasn't, but most of us aren't accepted as we are. We're not masking to fit in, trying to fool you all, pretending we're not like you. That's not it. We're actually rejected as we are. So we have to protect ourselves. And the only way to do that is masking. And when you're masking, you don't communicate the way you should be communicating. You're copying the way other people communicate. For me, I spent years not saying what I wanted to say. I would just say whatever I thought someone wanted me to say. And that's not communicating. And that's what annoys me sometimes, because if I am advocating for autistic rights, people will say, but what about non-speaking autistics? Well, it doesn't really matter if we can speak anyway, does it? Because, a lot of people just don't listen. Actually, that's a question for you, Endeavor, if you don't mind answering it in a minute. Do people actually say to you, because, the way we often get like, you don't speak for all autistics. Do people ever say to you, you don't speak for all AAC users? I wanted to ask you that, actually, if you don't mind. I've got 2 more slides. I'm going to come back to you on that one. So yeah, I mean, I'm laughing, but look, masking is not a pleasant experience for any of us. It's not anything to actually laugh at. But anyway, I put in a green stop sign here. And I put that here so that people might understand, because I'm always trying to find ways to explain to maybe a non-autistic person what communication is like for autistics in a predominantly non-autistic world. So mixed signals that autistics get from non-autistics are like a green stop sign. If you're driving your car and you arrive at a green stop sign, it's confusing because green sends you a message to go, but the word stop sends you the message to stop. So you're getting 2 messages at the same time. So non-autistic people send us mixed messages, which can be confusing. I'm going to give you an example in a minute. They can be especially confusing if we also pick up on their emotional energy, because a lot of us can literally feel how the other person feels. So I think using a green stop sign kind of helps to explain what it's like when we're getting those mixed signals. This is one of the pages from my Connect books, which are the activity books. And I just explained that. It's like when, and people judge our way of communicating on their way of communicating. So they presume we're not listening even though we are. And this is an example of that. So when an autistic person is listening, we could be looking away. because to concentrate or to visualize what you're saying, we could be staring, we could be stimming, we could be jumping up and down, we could be moving about. So did you know that an autistic person who's listening really hard actually looks like a non-autistic person who's not listening at all? And that can be confusing. And it can be confusing for both parts. It can be confusing because you're an autistic and you're trying to read non-autistic body language, which is like the opposite of yours, and vice versa. And lots of people, maybe particularly kids in classrooms, people think they're not listening, whereas actually they are listening, and we listen best when we're moving, so that's where kind of miscommunication happens a lot. There it is, because we actually look completely different when we're listening. A non-autistic person who's listening looks at the person, makes eye contact, nods and smiles, gives friendly comments and compliments, and probably doesn't move about. So there, and then if we swap, this is what an autistic person looks like if they're listening. A non-autistic person looks like this when they're not listening. Of course it's confusing, and the more we talk about these things, the better. So I've included a few tips for communicating, because we do need to adapt our communication when we're talking to, people who have got a different language and culture. And, we wouldn't expect them to do all of the work, but unfortunately that has been the case when it has come to autistics. It's like we've had to do all the work for a long time. So I think it's, reasonable for people to meet us halfway. So tips for communicating, just have a few, I'll go through them quickly because I'm conscious of time, but it's really important to remember eye contact is not part of autistic communication. Some people can make eye contact, some people have learned eye contact, but it's really not a natural part. And anybody who did our sensory webinar would have listened to Mackie's ideas around this, and they were really, really interesting. So again, I would have said up to a few years ago, encourage kids to maybe look at the person, or, to kind of look in their direction. But I really think we need to be able to say that it's not part of autistic communicating. Why should we be fulfilling the need of somebody else for that, when it's not part of our culture? Things like avoiding vague phrasing. Like, I'm very visual. Not all autistic people are visual, but I am, and a lot of us are. So if you give us a vague phrase like stand over there, we're going to spend like 10 minutes trying to figure out what you meant. Whereas if the more specific you are, the better we can build a picture. That also changes that way, actually being a visual thinker impacts our communication as well. Like, if someone tells me a story, like a friend of mine one day, she drove down she came home and she was like, I nearly crashed the car. I drove down a one-way street. And my first response was, which street? Because I needed to picture it. But, she got annoyed because my first response wasn't, oh, you poor thing. I was going to obviously, but I had to visualize what she was saying first, because otherwise it was meaningless because I didn't translate it, and I'm always translating pictures. So again, how we think impacts our communication, obviously, and the fact that we can think in different ways impacts how we actually translate that. I had a really cool conversation with a few autistic friends about this recently. Some of them were thinking shapes, someone else was thinking in kind of colors, and we were talking about synesthesia and just how hard it is sometimes to get your thoughts into these word things, mouth sounds, because it's not actually the best way to communicate sometimes what's going on inside in our minds. So I think it's important to remember that sometimes a processing delay, it's not that our minds like slow down, our minds are actually always moving very quickly, I think, but we're trying to translate. So if there's a pause, that's your cue to say, will I say it a different way, or to rephrase what you're saying. Now, obviously that, and as Endever said, allow the pause as well. That mightn't be the sign if someone is using AAC. So I suppose it is about just getting to know the person, isn't it? And reading their cues and knowing kind of what's a normal pause for them, basically. We're literal interpreters, so we do take their stuff literally. I mean, I've learned, what's not literal at this, or people use slang. I use slang, but I probably will always still have to translate it. My first reaction would be the literal one. So it's important that people don't people remember that. Remember when you're explaining something, or when you're saying something to a literal interpreter, if you explain it, if you say something, like if you're a child and, someone says, I'm going to go blue in the face. That's scary, and then like, why is Johnny not going to school? Because he's wondering when teacher's going to go blue in the face. Or when someone says, I'm going to explode, when are they going to explode? So there's a lot of, and sometimes I kind of see, I suppose because I work with kids a lot, maybe kids being accused of being cheeky when actually they're just being literal. They're just, taking things literally. A few more tips before we finish. Be conscious of our social anxiety. Social anxiety is a massive part of unfortunately living as autistic people in this world, because we are socially rejected and not treated very well. So we are socially anxious, and I think it's important to be conscious of it and to honor it in a way, because sometimes forcing people into situations where they don't feel safe is actually just going to do more damage. It's really about making them build their, building confidence and making them feel safe, and then I suppose changing the environment so it is safer for them is much better than trying to push somebody into something that they don't want to do. Getting to know their stims, you know, the autistic person in your life, you know, your own stims, because everybody stims. And like for when I was diagnosed first, you know, I talked to other autistic people and they were all talking about stimming, and I was like, I don't stim, you know, but now I realize I do. I stim a lot. But, you know, my anxious stim would be spinning my rings around, and I'll just do that automatically. And it obviously gets faster the more anxious. So I don't have to tell someone who knows me that I'm anxious. They will just see it by, you know, if I do that. That's just one example. So communication is a two-way thing. Need to remember that. Two-way thing. And so is miscommunication, you know, because all of the stuff, even the DSM itself, you know, the way autism is defined says that communication is a one-way thing and autistics are really bad at it. You know, okay, so no, it's a two-way thing. And Damien Milton has written, I suppose, talks about the double empathy problem, which is, you know, relevant to this as well. So that's worth looking up. Pauses can mean you need to rephrase, and, you know, we pick up on the emotional energy in the room. And that's, people don't talk about autistics and emotions because we're not supposed to have them, or we're not supposed to know about them, or we can't tell them what they are, or we don't understand other people's emotions and all that kind of nonsense. We do. And actually, a lot of us are really good at picking up on other people's energy. So that's something to remember. Like it can affect, like, I mean, social situations can be very difficult. Like a funeral is really, like, if you pick up on everyone's emotions, it's really difficult in that situation. It can add to anxiety. Likewise, as a kid, probably still now, if everybody's laughing and having fun, like I'll be still like giddy 10 minutes later, you know. So we do kind of pick up on everything around us, on our whole environment, which includes the energy and people's energy and their emotions. So I suppose I just wanted to give people tips, a few quick tips this evening on, you know, how to change their communication, because I think that's where we need to go. And I know there are some, like, you know, brilliant advocates out there, kind of, you know, who really do appreciate that autistic people have our own way of communicating. And I really hope that we'll have more research, you know, on, you know, there's just I think the amazing way that autistic people are communicating, and I do think it's much more energy based. Probably why we don't need speech and words. But okay, so I'm going to finish on that. I know I got a little bit over time, sorry, but we're going to just leave a few minutes for questions and answers. I definitely want to hear Endevor's answer to my question, if that's all right. So Endeavor, will you answer that? And then if anybody else has a question, you can pop it in the Q&A.
Yes, I think especially because I do speak some of the time rather than being completely non-speaking, or because I started using AAC later in life, or because I can type some of the time rather than only using symbols. Somehow these things mean I can't know what other AAC users experience. Yet no one goes around pointing out that one speaking person can't speak for any other speaking person.
Yeah, it is crazy, isn't it? I just wondered, did you get the same thing? Because I thought you did. I kind of thought, yeah, you know, in some people's minds, you're not non-verbal enough. Yeah. So it's like I don't know what people need to, you know, to believe. But and then the whole thing is, it's like, but there are just like non-autistic people saying all this stuff about us and no one questions them. Like if you bring a child to the therapist or the doctor, they're not going, do you have research to back this up? You don't speak for all doctors. They don't do that. Like I don't know. Like, does it happen enough? Like you're involved in other kind of activism as well, are you?
Yes, I think disability activism is probably the biggest place it happens, though.
Okay. It kind of, yeah, because I was trying to think of it recently. I was kind of, I just haven't witnessed it. Anyway, you know, but I suppose I don't have, you know, I suppose autism is my kind of first step into activism or advocating, and I just can't imagine though, like a woman speaking on women's rights and so like, You don't, you know, it's, and like in every community, you have people with intellectual disabilities and who don't speak. But why is it such a big deal in the autistic community? You know, I mean, if I stood up about, if I was talking about women's, I don't know, whatever issues, and someone would be like, but you don't speak for non-speaking women, like it just wouldn't come into the question. It wouldn't come in.
It is weird.
Yeah, I don't see. That's it. I'm trying to figure it out, but maybe I should just accept. Really weird, you know. I think it is really weird. I can't get my head around it. It's like no matter what you say, yeah. And then they won't say it to people who are totally non-autistic. They can say whatever they want about us, but yeah, it's crazy. But hopefully we'll get through it. You know, I think we might have a question. Let's see, or is that just? Oh, Katie's asking, what are your thoughts on intensive interaction? Is that to do with social anxiety? What's intensive interaction? Is that where you're kind of introduced to, it sounds like you're made to interact with people intensively. Is that what it means, Katie? Will you just explain a little bit more? Do you know what it is, Endeavour? Intensive interaction. I think anything that says intensive never sounds good. No, don't, you know, like,
Fair.
yeah, like surely gentle stuff sounds better than intensive interaction. Oh wait, no, is that Katie explaining? Oh, give her a sec. Right, do intensive interaction. Is that to do with? Anyway, she's going to explain it in a minute. But and we might just, if anybody else has a question, you might just pop it up now. But I think that's it. So we'll probably finish with Katie's question when we understand what intensive interaction is. That's been really cool. It's been really good. This is your first time in Ireland, Endeavour. I feel like you're here.
I have been there one time before, but not for a couple decades.
Oh, you'll have to come back sometime. Yeah. When hopefully COVID goes, we'll have another real life event.
If it ever ends.
Yeah, I know, it feels like it's never going to. This is it. Maybe this is just it forever now. Who knows? So Katie is saying, to my understanding, it involves community. Why did you ask us the question, Katie, when you don't know what it is properly? I know Katie, sorry, that's messing. But to my understanding, it involves communicating with a person by following their lead, their sounds and stims, and expanding on that. Oh, okay. Then it's something totally different, and their movements. I hadn't heard of that before. Intensive interaction. So, do you have an opinion on that, Endeavour, or that's?
At face value, it seems like it might be useful, but I imagine it would be more meaningful coming from fellow autistic peers rather than random non-autistic adults with their own goals for you.
Yeah, I think I can't have an opinion on it when I don't know what the goals of the therapy are. But Katie's usually on the ball with these things and is very pro-autistic, so maybe I can find out later. Intensive interaction. Okay, I'll have to look it up. So I don't think anyone else has a question. So yeah, I'm just gonna say thanks to everybody for joining us this evening, and thanks to everybody who's watching this recording. Thank you so much for joining me, Endeavor. It's been really cool. Like, I don't know, it's I suppose even just doing this with you is kind of like, what is people's problem? Like with, I mean, there's no issues with communication. We're very well, it's like it's, I mean, and this is one of the issues I actually have with maybe some employment agencies for autistic people. It's very much about kind of, they don't talk about creating opportunities for like AAC users in the workplace, and sometimes I do think we leave people behind in some kind of some of our advocacy maybe around things like that. But like, yeah, I like it's. I hope some parents watch this and kind of that it maybe makes them less fearful, because I think it is ableism. It's ableism that kind of puts this fear into people, and because they want what's best for their child. Like, I totally get it. I mean, like, they want what's best for their child. They don't want their child to have a hard life. And I've tried to explain this to people, but it's kind of like, well, if I was a lesbian, my life might be harder than if I was straight. But like, my parents wanting me to be straight just because I'd have a better life isn't the answer. It's, wanting society to change. And it's the same thing for non-speakers. So
Exactly.
yeah, and people, I think, using that phrase, he's not speaking yet. Like, we have to get rid of the yet. Yeah, because that's an expectation,
Yes, I hear people calling their kids pre-verbal, and that is just gross. Places so much value on speech rather than honoring other options.
Yeah, it was something you said earlier. Yes, that when you said, it was just an interesting point. When people say AAC hinders speech, that yes, that they're kind of giving themselves away a little bit, that they're still putting speech. And look, that's the society we live in. We're kind of made believe that speech is the be all and end all. But when you actually sit back and look at it and think about it, it's not. Like, and particularly now, we've so much access to different types of technology.
People will tell their friends, "Don't call me, I prefer text messages," but still think it is weird for an autistic person to use AAC for in-person communication.
Yeah, yeah. I just think, as a society, we just don't think enough. on everything. And I think like I think it just goes to our school system, our education system. You know, kids come in when they're young. We just teach them stuff. Accept this, accept this. We don't allow them to explore it. We don't let them analyze it. We don't. They definitely can't ask questions. You know, and we just kind of grow up accepting what we're fed. You know, and we just really don't analyze and kind of go, where do these thoughts come from, and are they even right in the first place? You know, I would love to see, and I think it would be really interesting. I don't know if this experiment has ever been done, but like at preschool, so it's kind of like kindergarten. So when kids are three to four, maybe before they go to school, like what if they, you know, if they taught kids sign language? Like I think we should all be learning sign anyway. Sign, you know, AAC, let's say with sure whatever pet, not pets, pictures, or iPads, you know, sign, speech, and we taught kids the three like alongside each other. It'd be so interesting to see what kids would do and kind of what they'd favor actually as well. It'd be just a really interesting bit of research to do, wouldn't it?
I have a couple links along those lines I can send you later.
Oh, like has it been done?
Not in a real study, but one family introduced their apparently neurotypical kid to AAC before they even turned two, if I remember correctly.
Okay, will you send me on those links? I'd love to, because I just think it'd be, yeah, it's something really interesting to explore. Because we don't give people options. It's like you have to speak. Actually, yeah, brilliant. Okay, I look forward to them. I think the two main things I took away from the vast amount of information you gave us this evening, it was really, really insightful. Thank you. I think two things that I took away is, and I know it's kind of you know, presumed competence, but I just really liked the way you said this was, you know, believe we have something to say. I think that's so important, and believing that, you know, whether it's a kid or an adult, that they have something to say. Um, and having that belief, I think, will actually lead people to finding ways and just being determined. Um, my mom used to always say, what is it, necessity is the mother of invention. I just think when we have that belief, we will power through and we will actually just find a way. So I really, really, yeah, that just kind of struck a chord with me. And the second thing was, it's a fault in the environment, not us, and lack of access to AAC. Absolutely.
I'm big on hammering home that point. Like, to me, I have no problem with the fact that I am mostly non-speaking, but I have a problem with my AAC being taken away, or I don't mind when I see kids growing up without speech. What I find inhumane is that they are growing up without AAC.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something that it's just, again, it just kind of has concreted things that I've been thinking, and yeah, it's really important. And I think any of us, you know, I suppose we probably do have other autistic advocates, you know, watching this, and yeah, I think we all need to hammer those messages home, you know, and not leave anyone behind. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. It's been brilliant. And hopefully we'll do something again, you know, and something different. I'm sure it'll be cool. So yeah, thank you. It's been brilliant. It's been lovely meeting you, and it's been fabulous doing this with you. So I'll be in touch soon. And thank you to everybody for joining us, and everybody who's watched the recording. Thank you, I suppose, and you know, hope that you all kind of leave with some messages and you know, a way to maybe help us spread our messages, you know, outside of the autistic community, because we do need our help. We do need help. We do need allies. So thank you, everybody. Thanks, Endeavour. Have a good weekend, everybody. Bye. Bye.